Good evening. My name is Patrick Leahy. I serve as the Executive Vice President here at the University of Scranton. On behalf of our President and our entire administration, I'd like to welcome you to this special occasion at this special time in the history of our university. Tonight, we continue the celebration of the inauguration of our 25th President in our 123rd year of our history. This is the third event of our inauguration celebration, and what a fitting event I think you'll find here this evening. Tonight we're going to hear from three distinguished attorneys. You're going to hear more proper introductions of them in just a minute when they are invited to the podium, but I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming them here at the start. We'll begin, of course, with the first great attorney, our incoming president, the Reverend Kevin Quinn of the Society of Jesus. Father Quinn. The second great attorney you'll hear from is an alum of this university. In fact, I just learned tonight he served as the president of the student government when he was here back in the 70s. He's our local magistrate judge, my great friend Jim Gibbons. Judge Gibbons. And the third great attorney, of course, is our featured speaker of this evening, all the way from Australia to be with us tonight, the Reverend Frank Brennan of the Society of Jesus. Father Brennan. Welcome, all three. We have many current trustees, many former trustees, many members of the Scranton community here with us tonight. We're joined, of course, tonight as well by many of our faculty and many students, which, of course, is the heart of the matter here at the University of Scranton. Thank you all for being here. At the risk of embarrassing this great friend of the university, there's just one person that I would like to shout out in particular this evening. She is a member of our Board of Trustees, a close friend of this university, and the former First Lady of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Mrs. Ellen Casey. Mrs. Casey, thank you for being here. Again, thank you all. What a great turnout. Now let's begin this evening's event the way we always begin important events here at this Catholic and Jesuit institution. That is in prayer. I'd like to invite Elise Gower, who's the coordinator of the International Service Programs here at the university, to provide our invocation. Elise?
Let us pray. Loving God, we gather this evening in community. We come together, shaped by the gifts of diversity, united by a faith that calls us to be one. Grant us compassion and humility as we unravel the realities of an imbalanced world. May we reflect through the lens of humanity and compassion. Deepen our appreciation of the opportunity to choose peace. Help us to listen to the silenced voices of the marginalized. Remove from our hearts that which hinders us from celebrating the dignity of each human being. We pray for our global family. May our brothers and sisters, restrained by the walls of poverty, discrimination, war, religious persecution, and all that prevents equality and justice, feel your unwavering love and presence. Through your transformative grace, help us to mirror the image of acceptance, joining in solidarity to shatter the barriers that divide. We pray for the church. Inspire in each member the cultivation of intellect and outreach. May we embrace the communal call to spread your message through word and deed. Expand our hearts to welcome all people, especially those we have forgotten. We ask your blessing upon Father Brennan. May his words stir awareness, shake our indifference, and inspire change. Continue to guide our footsteps on the journey. Amen.
least, thank you for your prayer, and thank you for the great way in which you manage our international service programs here at the university. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our new president. Since our new president will be formally introduced later this week, I've been asked to give the simple short form version introduction. So I'd simply like to ask you to join me, ladies and gentlemen, in welcoming the person who will be inaugurated as the 25th president of the University of Scranton later this week, the Reverend Kevin P. Quinn of the Society of Jesus.
Thank you, Pat. And thank you all for coming for this special event. Just looking out at the crowd here, all I can say is, wow. Everybody's here. Thank you so much. My friends, tonight you will hear from a Jesuit priest who has traveled a long way to speak to us this evening. My good friend and mate from down under, Frank Brennan. Not to steal the thunder of Frank's introduction, but Frank is a model for all that we seek to be here at the University of Scranton. He is a man who speaks for those who cannot, and one who is tirelessly trying to make the world a better, more merciful place. As we were planning the inauguration week of events, and the organizers are right in front of me, it was important to me to present a lecture focused on real-life issues while emphasizing our mission as a Catholic and Jesuit university. You will see in a few moments that Frank Brennan is the perfect choice for this task. Tonight, he will speak on how we make human rights and religions friends, not foes. Given daily headlines about world events, I cannot think of a timelier topic. I'm sure that this lecture is just a starting point for our discussion here at the university. I thank Frank in advance for starting this discussion and for traveling all the way from Australia, 22 hours, to join us here this evening. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce the next speaker who will formally introduce Father Brennan to you. He is the Honorable James A. Gibbons of the class of 1979. Judge Gibbons is a magistrate in Lackawanna County and a founding member of the University of Scranton's Council of Alumni Lawyers. Judge Gibbons.
Thank you, Father. Welcome, everyone. I have to say that I was somewhat surprised when I was contacted by Bobby Davis, the executive assistant to Father Quinn, about doing the introduction of Father Brennan. And I was so surprised that I said, why me? And he said, well, there are a couple of reasons. First, we'd like to have somebody who's an alumnus of the university. Father Quinn just told you I'm a member of the class of 79. He said, we'd also like to have a member of the local bench and bar, because Father Brennan's a lawyer and Father Quinn is a lawyer, and I said, okay, that makes sense, I fit that. And so we'd also like to have somebody who's involved locally, and Father Quinn just told you I'm involved with the Council of Alumni Lawyers. I used to be on the Alumni Board of Governors. I'm chairman of our local bar association's annual Red Mass. It sounded reasonable enough. So then I called Dr. Pat Leahy to find out the real reason that I was asked to do this. And Pat said, we're good friends, and so he can be honest with me. And he said, we need somebody who's expendable in case the night doesn't go very well. Once again, I fit the bill. So I want you all to get a good look at me, because if the night doesn't go very well, I may not be around here much longer. Before I get to introducing Father Brennan, I want to welcome Father Quinn to the great Northeast and the university community. No doubt since you've been here in July, you've been learning a lot about the community. And I know that you're familiar with the principle of 6 degrees of separation, the notion that, everybody's, everybody's very closely related. Well, around here it's only about 2.5 degrees. Let me give you an example. Father Brennan. My mother's paternal grandmother was a Brennan. My grandfather was James Brennan O'Brien, and my wife and I have a son named Brennan, James Gibbons. And now that I think about it, Father Quinn, my mother's mother was Margaret Quinn. And my wife and I have a daughter named Quinn Marie Gibbons. So we're probably cousins. I think I may get invited back after all. My oldest daughter is here. I introduced her to you, and she said to me, she was excited. She said, "Did you Google Father Brennan?" And I said, "Well, not public." But I did. I was proud to be able to do that, and I have some good news for you. There are 6 Frank Brennans that come up. 2 of them are still alive, and you're one of them. So let me tell you a little bit about my cousin, Father Frank Brennan. He is, as has been mentioned already, a lawyer. He's also a professor at Australian Catholic University, the Australian National University College of Law, and the National Center for Indigenous Studies. He's a Jesuit priest, entering the Society of Jesus in 1975 and ordained in 1985. Now, Father, I know that there's a strong tradition in the Society of Jesus for an examination of conscience, but 10 years? That must have been some examination of conscience. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Politics and a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Queensland. He has a Bachelor of Divinity in Theology from the Melbourne College of Divinity. And he has a Master of Laws from the University of Melbourne. He has a Doctorate of the University degree from Queensland University of Technology. He was admitted to the bar in Queensland in 1977 and the Victorian bar in 1978. And if that wasn't enough, in 1995 he was a Fulbright Scholar at Georgetown Law School. That's where he met Father Quinn, our other cousin. And he's held academic appointments at Boston College, Georgetown, and Santa Clara. And maybe, if you play your cards right, someday you'll play Scranton. He was director of the Jesuit Refugee Service in East Timor when it became independent. And in 2009, he was appointed by the Government of Australia to chair the Australian National Human Rights Consultation Committee. It was a very big, big thing. Father Brennan has been a tireless advocate for Indigenous peoples and refugees, especially the Aboriginal people of Australia. He's been named an Officer of the Order of Australia for his service to the Aborigines. And in 1998, he was named a Living National Treasure in Australia, which is much better than a dead national treasure. But I think one of the greatest compliments in reading up about you is that you've been referred to by several past prime ministers of Australia as a meddling priest. And to me, that's a badge of honor. I think that's a great thing. But what else would you expect from somebody who was mentored by Father Bob Drinan? By my count, he's written at least 6 books on Aboriginal land rights and an equal number on civil liberties and human rights. Honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great privilege to present my cousin, Father Frank Brennan.
President, Pat, Elise, Mrs. Casey, ladies and gentlemen. I note that this university was founded in 1888 by Bishop William O'Hara, the first Bishop of Scranton, and that one of your chief benefactors of late has been a Brennan, and thus the imposing presence of Brennan Hall here on the campus. Being a Brennan, and my mother an O'Hara, of which His Honour was not aware, I am delighted to be invited to the other side of the world to honour your new university president, Father Kevin Quinn, though any blood relationships to your founders or benefactors might need to be traced back to the bog. But, Your Honour, you and I can work that out later in the evening. Your motto, Religio Mores Cultura, grounds all our reflections upon ourselves and upon the world which we serve. Down under, in the southern hemisphere, it is spring. Last week, I took a stroll past your US Embassy in Canberra, the Australian national capital. Your embassy is a very imposing fortressed Georgian red brick complex. To quote the embassy blurb, the observer is provided a glimpse of the charm and stately beauty of colonial Williamsburg that was a fountainhead of liberty and freedom in the life of the new American Republic. On the fence of the embassy, the golden spring sunlight at dusk was illuminating the almost 3,000 small flags placed commemorating those who died in that tragic event of 9/11 10 years ago, including more than 300 foreign nationals from more than 50 countries, 10 of whom were Australians. The sea of stars and stripes was dotted with flags of other nations whose nationals had perished alongside yours. America's great onshore tragedy has reverberated throughout the world. Here at Scranton, your links to 9/11 are not just to New York City and the capital, but also to Shanksville, 250 miles from here, where United Airlines Flight 93 came down. 10 years on, our societies are still wrestling with finding the balance between individual human rights and national security in this new global configuration. While espousing religious freedom, we know that some express their religious beliefs with contempt for others, and we face afresh the limits on religious freedom and freedom of conscience. The relationship between religion, culture, and morals is freshly contested. Your friends from other lands hope and pray that the American mix of idealism and pragmatism will ensure that your ideals are strengthened through this reconfiguration and your pragmatism rewarded with workable protections for all in the community. Last week, President Obama wrote to the Australian Prime Minister saying, "In the decade since the attacks, we've had no more steadfast partner than Australia in our efforts to defeat terrorists in Afghanistan, in Bali, in the Middle East, and in Southeast Asia." Like all friends, let's hope we can learn from each other, even critically, and not just support each other uncritically as we confront the great moral quandaries and challenges of our age. I'm one of those Jesuits from elsewhere in the world who's profited much from knowing American Jesuits and their collaborators both onshore and offshore. One of my very formative life experiences was spending a few months in a large refugee camp on the Thai-Cambodian border in 1987. There were 100,000 Khmer people in Site 2 camp. I went to look at the human rights situation there. On arrival, one of my housemates, American Mary Sutpin, warned me as I was about to drive off in a car, "Be careful, it takes a while to get used to driving on the wrong side of the road." I replied, "Mary, I've never driven on any other side of the road." Though we speak the same language, we come from very different backgrounds and life experiences. The authorities were not minded to admit a Jesuit lawyer into the camp for the purpose of scrutinising human rights violations. So I was assigned to teach a management course to the refugees. My mentor was an American Jesuit, Ron Anton. He armed me with the standard American textbook on management. Being one page ahead of the students with Management 101, I asked them to list those resources which were plentiful, those which were relatively scarce, and those which were rare, pointing out that management was largely focused on the best harnessing of relatively scarce resources. They were able to list only two plentiful resources in the camp: air and human beings. Everything else, including the water, was rare and had to be rationed, and usually corruptly. There was nothing relatively scarce to manage. We had to revise the textbook fairly radically for local conditions. Our Jesuit Refugee Service team was headed by a very charismatic French Jesuit, Pierre Sirac. One day, the shelling and exchange of fire came close to the camp, and all us volunteers were called out. Having headed out of the camp, our convoy of NGO vehicles was lined up stationary on a remote Thai country road. In the opposite direction came Father Pierre in his old beat-up utility, a Toyota. He was smoking his French cigarettes, demanding entrance to the camp. The United Nations and Thai authorities were unwilling to admit him, but he insisted. He stayed the night. The rest of us did not get back inside the camp for some days. The Georgetown medical team members were furious with Father Pierre, and for good reason. They said he could give no practical help in the camp if it were to be shelled, and if he were injured, there would be a risk that the international NGOs, including the doctors, would not be allowed back into the camp for weeks. With a French existential hunching of the shoulders, he surmised, "What else could I do? I had to be with the women and the children." He had accompanied the refugees for 10 years. He did not want to abandon them in their hour of need. His presence that night was almost sacramental. It transformed the quality of his presence to the refugees on all those other days when the shelling was far distant. Father Pierre was right. So too was the Georgetown medical team. I've been a regular visitor to Jesuit universities here in the United States. One of the things I enjoy most about you Americans is that you love conversation and public disputation about contested moral and ethical issues. You are relentless in your inquiry whether Father Pierre was more right than the Georgetown medical team. You concede that there might be another side of the road on which to drive. You're open to adapting your management principles to previously unimagined real-life situations. But in all these instances, it requires dialogue and the risk that your critics will think that you are too fixated on process and status, two words that always give you away, whatever your accents. You often think the law must require an answer to political and moral quandaries. As you've heard, I first met your new president, Father Kevin Quinn, at Georgetown Law Centre, where we were both mentored by Bob Drinan, who's already been mentioned, and Father Ladislaus Orsi, having been inspired by the writing of John Courtney Murray, who once wrote, "The spiritual order of society is founded on truth, on the true view of man, his dignity, his duties and rights, his freedoms and obligations. This order must be brought into being under fidelity to the precepts of justice, whose vindication is the primary function of the public power, as well as the primary civic duty of the citizenry. This order needs to be animated and perfected by love, for civic unity cannot be achieved by justice and law alone. Love is the ultimate force that sustains all human beings living together. Finally, this order is to achieve increasingly more human conditions of social equality without any impairment of freedom." I think that quote of Murray could keep most of us going for a lifetime, or at least for 3 or 4 years' study at Scranton. To me, Drinan was the epitome of the modern American Jesuit, committed to the faith that does justice, passionately active on the international stage, espousing human rights, testing the limits of church involvement in politics at home, and not afraid of conflict. Orsi had that refined European touch, but with a fierce independence, turning church teaching about human rights and human dignity back on the church itself, insisting on due process within the life of the church community. In his latest book, Orsi proposes that in the quadrangle of every university, a monument should be erected dedicated to the anonymous inquiring students who keep the teachers' minds fresh. That might be the first building project for President Quinn. Having known Father Quinn at Georgetown and at Santa Clara, I'm delighted to come as a visitor and to honour him at his inauguration as Scranton President by reflecting on human rights and the contemporary challenge offered by Father Adolfo Nicolas, Superior General of the Jesuits, who's urged Jesuit universities to promote depth of thought and imagination, rediscovering universality, and being places of learned ministry which mediate between faith and culture. In Mexico last year, many of us gathered from Jesuit universities around the world under the leadership and inspiration of the late Father Paul Locatelli to hear Father Nicolas put before us three major challenges in response to what he calls the pervasive globalization of superficiality, by which we can be overwhelmed with such a dizzying pluralism of choices and values and beliefs and visions of life, then one can so easily slip into the lazy superficiality of relativism or mere tolerance of others and their views. Father General told us, first, in response to the globalization of superficiality, I suggest that we need to study the emerging cultural world of our students more deeply and find creative ways of promoting depth of thought and imagination. Second, in order to maximise the potentials of new possibilities of communication and cooperation, I urge Jesuit universities to work towards operational international networks. Finally, to counter the inequality of knowledge distribution, I encourage a search for creative ways of sharing the fruits of research with the excluded, and in response to the global spread of secularism and fundamentalism, I invite Jesuit universities to a renewed commitment to the Jesuit tradition of learned ministry which mediates between faith and culture. So, how can those of us inspired by the Jesuit tradition help to make human rights and religion friends, not foes? How can we form communities of dialogue in the search of truth and understanding about human rights and their limits, and about the place of religion in the state and in society? The trouble with much human rights discourse is that it's too readily reduced to assertions just about individual rights and non-discrimination. Human rights discourse needs to be more subtle when it comes to a conflict of rights situation, or when the law is having to consider the public interest or the common good, as well as individual liberties. In the public square, human rights discourse is usually conducted against a backdrop of presumed atheism and without much serious consideration for the rights of religious freedom and conscience. The challenge to the contemporary Jesuit university is providing a truly Catholic ambience where every intellectual idea about human rights can be examined from all sides, espousing human dignity in the light of the Church's tradition. Human rights and religion can only enhance each other when studied and lived in a vibrant Jesuit university committed to learning, service and research. Their friendship can be cultivated even in the midst of culture wars. When director of the Jesuit Refugee Service in the newly emerging nation of East Timor in 2001, I accompanied Bishop Bello, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, at the Mass which was offered in thanks for the contribution by the departing international peacekeepers. At the end of the Mass, an Australian Major General, Peter Cosgrove, spoke. This burly Australian commander was accompanied by a translator who was a petite Timorese religious sister in her pure white habit, replete with veil. Before them was the usual international media scrum, which accompanies such events in countries overrun by the United Nations and international NGOs. Cosgrove recalled his first visit to the cathedral 3 months earlier, when he was so moved by the singing that he realised two things. The people of East Timor had not abandoned their God, and God had not abandoned the people of East Timor. His words surprised me, and I knew that this speech would not be reported back in Australia. Down under, we don't do religion in public in that way. It was unimaginable that an Australian military leader would give such a speech back in Australia. I dare say if Cosgrove was a US general, we might expect it. Many citizens wanting to contribute to the shaping of law, public policy and conversation in the public square come to the task with their own comprehensive worldview. For some, that view is shaped not just by their culture and intellectual peers, but also by their religious tradition and beliefs. Just because they do not often talk about such tradition and beliefs outside their own circle of family and friends does not mean that these traditions and beliefs are left at home once the individual steps into the public square. When launching his foundation on faith and globalisation, the retired British Prime Minister Tony Blair observed that his former press secretary, Alastair Campbell, was fond of saying, "We don't do God." Blair clarified that Campbell didn't mean that politicians shouldn't have faith, just that it was always a packet of trouble to talk about it. Whether or not our comprehensive worldview is shaped by religious influences, it informs the development of values which the individual expresses and lives out in their own specific cultural context. From those values, one is able to articulate principles which underpin informed and considered decision-making about laws, public policies, and public deliberation on contested social questions. A year ago, to the disapproval of some of my family and friends, I agreed to appear on television with the ubiquitous atheist Christopher Hitchens. As I said to family and friends at the time, it's part of my day job. Somebody has to do it. Something crystallised for me that night when a young member of the television audience said, "Hello, comrades. Can we ever hope to live in a truly secular society when the religious maintain their ability to affect political discourse and decision-making on issues such as voluntary euthanasia, same-sex unions, abortion and discrimination in employment?" The TV compere and Hitchens were clearly simpatico with this approach, as were many in the audience. But I was dumbstruck, wondering, how can we ever hope to live in a truly democratic society when secularists maintain their demand that people with a religious perspective not be able to claim a right to engage in the public square, agitating about laws, even on issues such as voluntary euthanasia, same-sex unions, abortion, and discrimination in employment? We have just as much right as our secularist fellow citizens to contribute in the public square, informed and animated by our worldview and religious tradition. We acknowledge that it would be prudent to be able to put our case in terms comprehensible to those who do not share that worldview or religious tradition when we're wanting to win the support and acceptance of others, especially if we be in the minority. But there's no requirement of public life that we engage only on secularist terms. And we definitely insist on the protection of our rights, including the right to religious freedom, even if it not be a right highly praised and prized by the secularists. One of my US role models, Father Brian Hare, put it well when reflecting on John Courtney Murray's mode of engagement in the public square. Hare said this: "I'm deeply interested in, but not yet convinced by the argument that a more explicitly theological style of assertion using religious symbols to interpret and adjudicate justice claims is more appropriate to the questions faced by the Church in the United States today. To specify both my interests and my scepticism, it's necessary to distinguish the need for shaping the mind of the Church as a community and an institution regarding social questions from the task of projecting the perspective of the Church into the social debate about normative questions of social policy. The Oxford academic John Finnis, in his new book of essays, Religion and Public Reason, identifies three types of practical atheism: that there is no God, that God is unconcerned with human affairs, and that God is easily satisfied with human conduct or easily appeased or bought off. He reminds us that neither atheism nor radical agnosticism is entitled to be treated as the default position in public reason, deliberation and decisions. Those who say or assume that there's a default position and that it's secular in those senses owe us an argument that engages with and defeats the best arguments for divine causality, he says. Though it might be prudent and strategic to suggest that religious accommodationists carry the onus of persuasion in a public square with a secularist prejudice, might there not be a case for arguing that the representatives of the more populist majoritarian mindset in the public square need to be more accommodating of religious views? Professor Finnis, a Catholic, but making a point equally applicable to all faith communities, says, outside the Church, it's widely assumed and asserted that any proposition which the Catholic Church in fact proposes for acceptance is by virtue of that fact a religious, not a philosophical, scientific or rationally grounded and compelling proposition, and is a proposition which Catholics hold only as a matter of faith and therefore cannot be authentically willing to defend as a matter of natural reason. For Finnis, much of what John Rawls in his political liberalism describes as public reason can be equated with natural reason, whereas Rawls would rely only on an overlapping consensus, not wanting to press for objective reality of right and wrong. Finnis would contest that the only content of an overlapping consensus would be that which can be objectively known through natural reason. In 2008, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, gave an insightful address in the London School of Economics, pointing out that rights and utility are the two concepts that resonate most readily in the public square today. But we need concepts to set limits on rights when they interfere with the common good or the public interest, or dare I say it, public morality. The concepts used by the United Nations when first formulating and limiting human rights 60 years ago. These concepts are no longer in vogue, at least under those titles. We also need concepts to set limits on utility when it interferes with the dignity of the most vulnerable and the liberty of the most despised in the community. Addressing the UN General Assembly to mark the anniversary of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Pope Benedict said, "This document was the outcome of a convergence of different religious and cultural traditions, all of them motivated by the common desire to place the human person at the heart of institutions, laws, and the workings of society." Mary Ann Glendon's book, A World Made New, traces the remarkable contribution to that document by your own Eleanor Roosevelt, and an international bevy of diplomats and academics whose backgrounds give the lie to the claim that any listing of human rights is a Western culturally biased catalogue of capitalist political aspirations. The Frenchman, René Cassin, the Chilean, Hernan Santa Cruz, the Christian Lebanese, Adam Malik, and the Chinese Confucian, Peng Chun-chung, were great contributors to this truly international undertaking. They consulted religious and philosophical greats, such as Teilhard de Chardin and Mahatma Gandhi. Even Aldous Huxley made a contribution. It was the Jesuit paleontologist Teilhard de Chardin who counselled that the drafters should focus on man in society rather than man as an individual. The drafters knew that any catalogue of rights would need to include words of limitation. The Canadian John Humphrey, who was the director of the Secretariat servicing the drafting committee, prepared a first draft of the 48 articles. The Australian member of the drafting committee, Colonel Hodgson, wanted to know the draft's underlying philosophy. Humphrey refused to answer, replying that the draft was not based on any particular philosophy. It included rights recognised by various national constitutions and also a number of suggestions that had been made for an international Bill of Rights. Though later in his memoirs he did confess, "I wasn't going to tell him that insofar as it reflected the views of its author, who had in any event to remain anonymous, the draft attempted to combine humanitarian liberalism with social democracy." And so they had to look at words of limitation which might apply. Article 29 ultimately was worded, "Everyone has duties to the community which enables him freely to develop his personality. In the exercise of his rights, everyone shall be subject only to such limitation as are necessary to secure due recognition and respect for the rights of others and the requirements of morality, public order, and general welfare in a democratic society." 60 years later, these words of limitation don't seem to sit so readily with us, do they? But they still have work to do. Once we investigate much of the contemporary discussion about human rights, we find that often the intended recipients of rights do not include all human beings, but only those with certain capacities, or those who share sufficient common attributes with the decision makers. It's always at the edges that there is real work for human rights discourse to do. On one of my recent trips to Cambodia, I met a woman concerned for the well-being of a handful of children who had both cerebral palsy and profound autism. There are more than enough needy children in Cambodia, God knows. It's not surprising that religious persons often have a keen eye for the neediest, not only espousing their rights, but taking action for their well-being and human flourishing. When speaking at the London School of Economics, Rowan Williams boldly and correctly asserted, "The question of foundations for the discourse of non-negotiable rights is not one that lends itself to simple resolution in secular terms. So it's not at all odd if diverse ways of framing this question in religious terms flourish so persistently. The uncomfortable truth is that a purely secular account of human rights is always going to be problematic if it attempts to establish a language of rights as a supreme and non-contestable governing concept in ethics." No one should pretend that the discourse about universal ethics and inalienable rights has a firmer foundation than it actually has. Once we abandon any religious sense that the human person is created in the image and likeness of God, and that God has commissioned even the powerful to act justly, love tenderly, and walk humbly with their God, it may be very difficult to maintain a human rights commitment to the weakest and most despised in society. It may come down to the vote, moral sentiment, or tribal affiliations, and that will not be enough to extend human rights universally. In the name of utility, the society spared religious influence will have one less impediment to limiting social inclusion to those like us being the decision makers who determine which common characteristics render embodied persons eligible for human rights protection. The American scholar Nicholas Walterstorff says, "Our moral subculture of rights is as frail as it is remarkable. If the secularization thesis proves true, we must expect that that subculture will have been a brief shining episode in the odyssey of human beings on earth." In his 1789 letter to the Quakers, George Washington said, "I assure you very explicitly that in my opinion, the conscientious scruples of all people should be treated with great delicacy and tenderness, and it's my wish and desire that the laws may always be as extensively accommodated to them as a due regard for the protection and essential interests of the nation may justify and permit. Professor Martha Nussbaum's recent book, Liberty of Conscience, provides a rich textured treatment of the place of religion in the public square. In her characteristic writing mode, she shares personal anecdotes, this time her conversion from Christianity to Judaism on the occasion of marriage. She treats deftly the classics and then delves into philosophical reflection on US jurisprudence. This time she reflects on the agonising dilemma of Sophocles' Antigone when the state, in the person of her uncle Creon, has announced that she may not bury her brother killed attacking the city. Her religion dictates that she must bury her brother. She speaks of Creon's alarming rigidity. He has defined public policy in a way that favours the interests of most people in the city. In the process, however, he has imposed a tragic burden on one person. The great Athenian statesman Pericles boasted that 5th century democratic Athens did things better, refusing on principle to put people in such dreadful predicaments. Athens, he said, pursues the good of the city, but not by requiring its citizens to violate the unwritten laws of their religions. Nussbaum nicely posits the Lockean position of state neutrality, whereby the state is free to regulate matters concerning property or health or safety, even when they bear on religious organisations, so as long as it does so impartially, against the more subtle treatment of the 17th century American Roger Williams, founder of Rhode Island, who espoused religious accommodation with the declaration, "It's the will and the command of God that since the coming of his Son, the Lord Jesus, a permission of the most paganish, Jewish, Turkish, or anti-Christian consciences and worships be granted to all people in all nations and countries." Nussbaum concedes that there may be a need for religion to bear some burdens if the peace and safety of the state are really at stake, or if there's some extremely strong state interest. In his book Conscience and the Common Good, Robert K. Vischer points out that we need to consider not just the relationship between the citizen and the state. We also need to make space in society for individuals of good conscience to form associations freely and to act on conscience individually and collectively without unwarranted interference by others who in good conscience act and live differently. We need to consider only the law-abiding Muslim community, which wants to rely on some aspects of Sharia law when governing their own internal affairs, or the Catholic hospital, which reserves the right to provide what it regards as morally appropriate services while being in receipt of taxpayer funds for some service delivery. What do we say to the wedding photographer who does not wish to provide his services to same-sex couples, or to the church adoption agency which prefers to make children available for adoption to a family unit constituted by an adult male and an adult female, or to the pharmacist who conscientiously objects to providing the morning after pill? I dare say many civil libertarians are a little worried about the nuances of conscience because they share the view of Oxford academic Julian Savulescu that, for example, doctors' consciences should be left at the door in the name of patient autonomy. Doctors are simply there to provide a service, as if they are automatons. In his recent article, Conscientious Objection in Medicine, Savulescu commences with a literary reference, not to Sophocles' Antigone on this occasion, but to Shakespeare's Richard III. When Richard III, roused from his dream, he made his declaration, "Let not our babbling dreams affright our souls. Conscience is but a word that cowards use, devised at first to keep the strong in awe. Our strong arms be our conscience, swords our law." Savulescu quotes only the sentence, "Conscience is but a word that cowards use, devised at first to keep the strong in awe." Here's the context. During Richard's dream the night before going into battle, he confronted the 11 ghosts of those he'd callously murdered, including the ghost of Prince Edward, son of King Henry VI, who proclaimed, "Let me sit heavy on thy soul tomorrow. Think how thou hast stabbed me in the prime of youth. At Tewkesbury, despair therefore and die. And the ghost of King Henry VI himself, who proclaimed, when I was mortal, my anointed body by thee was punched full of deadly holes. Think on the Tower and me, despair and die. Harry VI bids thee despair and die. Hardly the model for the discerning medical practitioner, and hardly the literary quote likely to evince sympathy for the primacy of conscience, a non-derogable human right. For those who want swords to be their law, there's every reason to view conscience as a word used only by cowards. It's those sorts of people who demand that conscience be left at the door. It's only by discarding conscience at the door that one can argue doctors who compromise the delivery of medical services to patients on conscience grounds must be punished through removal of licence to practice and other legal mechanisms. Martha Nussbaum's concluding chapter in Liberty of Conscience is titled with a question, Towards an Overlapping Consensus, ? She makes the point that laws do matter, as good laws and institutions set limits on people's ability to act on their intolerant and egalitarian views. She describes Roger Williams' challenge to the new colonies, that they find and learn to inhabit a shared moral space without turning that space into a sectarian space that privileges some over others. Let me now turn to Robert Drinan. Robert Drinan was a Jesuit priest and lawyer who served 10 years in Congress before the Vatican finally got its way, insisting that he resign. Drinan first met the Kennedy clan in 1964. He joined a group of leading moral theologians down at the Kennedy compound at Hyannis Port. His biographer, Raymond Schroth, says, they hoped to come up with a stance on abortion acceptable to both Catholic teaching and the public at large. A decade before Roe v. Wade, this group proposed that the translation of a rigorously restrictive ethic of abortion into law was unlikely to be enforceable or achieve its positive goals without significant social evils. The issue was to dog Drinan all his public life. Before going into public life, Drinan tried to clear a path about the legal and moral complexities of abortion. Writing in Theological Studies in 1970, he said, this author has no easy solutions or ready options for the Catholic legislator, jurist or spokesman on the question of abortion and the law. Perhaps the central issue was described in the reasoning of John Courtney Murray, who, while not addressing himself to the question of abortion, wrote as follows about the criminal law. The moral aspirations of law are minimal. Law seeks to establish and maintain only that minimum of actualised morality that's necessary for the healthy functioning of the social order. It enforces only what is minimally acceptable and, in this sense, socially necessary. Therefore, the law, mindful of its nature, is required to be tolerant of many evils that morality condemns. In 1996, long after his departure from Congress, Drinan decided to publish an opinion piece in the New York Times in support of President Bill Clinton's veto of the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act. Church leaders went ballistic. At the insistence of the New England Provincial of the Jesuits, he retracted almost a year later, stating, I withdraw those statements and any statement that could be understood to cast doubt on the Church's firm condemnation of abortion, a doctrine that I today accept. A strong opponent of the Vietnam War, Drinan had become interested in running for Congress. His great backer was Jewish businessman Jerome Grossman, who knew Drinan to be a good friend of Israel. Grossman thought Drinan would deliver the Catholic vote for the Democratic Party in Massachusetts. Drinan needed to convince his religious superiors in Rome. There's been a long-running controversy whether Drinan did have approval to run from the then Superior General Pedro Arrupe. Arrupe promptly left the matter for determination by the Jesuit superiors here in the United States. Schroth says, it's reasonable to conclude that Arrupe did not want Drinan to run. In fact, Arrupe said publicly on several occasions that although he strongly urged Jesuits to fight for justice, he did not think they should participate in partisan politics as candidates for office, that the party politician priest would not be free to be the priest prophet. Each of the 5 times he came up for re-election to Congress, Drynan had first to renegotiate the permission from his superiors. Time ran out in 1979 after Pope John Paul II insisted that priests not serve in government in Nicaragua. Finally, it was the Pope who insisted that the Jesuit superiors instruct Drynan not to run for a 6th term. Drynan, who'd spent much time as congressman agitating international human rights, having moved the first motion of impeachment against President Nixon for the unauthorised bombing of Cambodia on the Feast of St. Ignatius in 1973, accepted the decision, and this is what he said: "I'm grateful to have had these opportunities as a moral architect. I can think of no other activities more worthy of the involvement of a priest and a Jesuit. I'm proud and honoured to be a priest and a Jesuit. As a person of faith, I must believe there is work for me to do, which somehow will be more important than the work that I'm required to leave." Drynan confided to a young Jesuit at the time that he was hurt, bitter and confused. Looking back on his congressional career, even his friends would concede that he was not always the greatest political strategist. For example, the bombing of Cambodia was not the issue on which the American people would finally move to impeach their president. His longtime friend, House Majority Leader Tip O'Neill, said, "Morally, Drynan had a good case. Publicly, he's always been proud that he was the first member of Congress to file for impeachment, but politically, he damn near blew it." In 1995, I first met Robert Drynan in Johannesburg, South Africa. The US government had funded his trip there, and he was giving a round of lectures on human rights. I then attended his international human rights course at Georgetown. After treating any topic, he would turn to me in a half-mocking tone and ask, "And how do you deal with this down under, in Australia?" Initially, I thought he was an American imperialist, convinced that the United States always found the best way of addressing any human rights question. While the US had the answers, the rest of us were playing catch-up. But over the course of the semester, I realised that Drynan, who'd travelled the globe extensively, had no preconceived notion about the best way. Much depended on the local circumstances. There were principles to espouse and to act upon in search of any solution. When he died, Senator Edward Kennedy and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi were the chief political mourners at the funeral. The preacher, Father John Langan, had this to say: "Any society built on the practice of rights is not so sweetly transcendent as the holy mountain of feasting and joy which Isaiah summons up for us. It's not so intimately and delicately responsive as the virtue of charity or agape which St. Paul commends to us. But it's essential to the realisation of the common good in a world which is marked by enormous human diversity and intermittently intense social conflict. It's a reality which protects those of us who are neither beasts nor angels from our own worst impulses and from the harms which others would do to us. It's not the realm of the best, but of the imperfect good and the necessary." In her eulogy, Nancy Pelosi said Father Drynan lived and legislated according to the expansive view of the gospel, believing that it had something to teach about the whole range of public policy, from war and peace to poverty and justice to how we treat our children and our parents. It was because of his faith that he was one of our greatest champions of human rights. The biographer Schroth asks, to what degree had Drynan answered the question, can a priest successfully be an elected politician? Drynan would say yes. The Pope said no. Grossman says today that the answer is no. The roles are basically incompatible, except for Drynan. He was a special case, chosen for a special mission, to stop the Vietnam War. He did a great job, said Grossman, but he should be the last of his kind. This Australian Jesuit lawyer humbly agrees. I'm one Jesuit lawyer who learnt much from Bob Drynan in his strivings to bridge the gap between idealism and pragmatism, enhancing human rights and respecting human dignity in the midst of cultural, philosophical and religious diversity. He made mistakes, we all do. He was hurt and scarred in the public square, almost anyone who ventures in there is. He maintained a simple faith and a profound pride in the Jesuits. Let's hope we can too. In May this year, we Australian Catholics were treated to the early retirement of one of our most pastoral bishops. His name was William Morris. Overseeing a large country diocese with very few and ageing priests, he knew he needed to provide for the day when there would not be enough priests to celebrate Mass. He'd written to the diocese indicating several responses have been discussed internationally, nationally and locally, including the ordination of women and the recognition of other churches' orders. He invited discussion while remaining committed actively to promoting vocations to the current celibate male priesthood and being open to inviting priests from overseas. When quizzed by the media, he said he would ordain single or married women and married men if church policy changed. This was too much for the Vatican. They sent a visitator who compiled a confidential report which has never been shown to the bishop or to his consultors, and subsequently he was sacked. One of the unfortunate aspects of this affair is that no church official is in a position to inform the people of God about the due process which was followed, the case against the bishop, and the justice of the decisions made by curial officials leading to the recommendation made to the Pope that Bishop Morris be relieved of office. In his recent commentary on the regulations for the examination of doctrines, Ladislaus Orsi, our other erstwhile colleague at Georgetown, wrote this: "The virtue of justice, as integrated with faith, hope and love among Christians, is a powerful factor in forging unity in the community. For this reason, it's never enough to do justice, it must be done publicly. The people should see that justice is done. Of course, prudence and discretion may require some confidentiality. When it's needed, so be it. But when there are no greater values in jeopardy, openness should be the rule. A trial is never about one single individual. The accused is a member of a community of believers. Whether he's guilty or not, the community nurtured him and suffers with him. It's fair, therefore, that the community should be informed in a prudent manner." While there can be little useful reflection and critique of the final decision of the Pope to force the early retirement of the bishop, there's plenty of scope to review the processes and the evidence leading to the submission of the brief for dismissal provided by the curial officials to the Holy Father. These officials acted primarily on written complaints by a small minority of the faithful and of the presbyterate of the diocese, the report of the visitator, and the responses provided by the bishop, who was unable to cite the complaints or the report. His fellow bishops in Australia attested to his exemplary pastoral practice, and yet he was informed by the nuncio that his pastoral practice was said to be flawed and defective. Due to a lack of due process, natural justice and transparency, the papacy has been harmed. The standing of the Vatican Curia has been harmed. The public standing of all of the Australian bishops meeting in conference has been undermined, and the confidence of the Australian Church in the public square compromised. The Church cannot credibly proclaim a message of social justice in a pluralist democracy when its own processes fall so demonstrably short of community standards of justice. And here is the role of a university. As John Courtney Murray once wrote, "The public consensus is the property of the studium. This is the institution that, together with the Church, stood between the people and the princes, the men of power who bore the responsibility of using their power in the high service of justice and freedom of the people. It's the function of the university, which has care both for the princes and the people, to see that this duty is wisely performed, chiefly by defining what justice is and what the freedom of the people requires in changing circumstances." Who are the persons of reason to whom the people and the princes might look for judgment? With his characteristic lack of gender inclusiveness, Murray, a man of his time, answers with a kernel of eternal truth wrapped in the language of the day. He says all one can say is that they are the men who have a care but who are not interested parties. The great sinologist Simon Leys, now known also by his real name, Pierre Ryckmans, when contemplating Newman's idea of a university, once called to mind Gustave Flaubert when he was writing to his friend Ivan Turgenev. I've always tried to live in an ivory tower, but a tide of excrement is beating at its walls, threatening to undermine it. The tide of which he speaks is the torrent of abuse one receives from outside the university about its elitist character as an ivory tower and its non-utilitarian output. Lees thinks we should be unapologetic about our place in the ivory tower of learning. He says, democracy is the only acceptable political system, yet it pertains to politics exclusively and has no application in any other domain. When applied anywhere else, it is death. For truth is not democratic, intelligence and talent are not democratic, nor is beauty, nor love, nor God's grace. A truly democratic education is an education that equips people intellectually to defend and promote democracy within the political world, but in its own field, education must be ruthlessly aristocratic and highbrow, shamelessly geared towards excellence. He invokes Zhuangzi, a Taoist philosopher of the 3rd century BC and one of the most profound minds of all time. The philosopher said, people all know the usefulness of what is useful, but they do not know the usefulness of the useless. Leys taught Chinese studies to our last Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, when he was an undergraduate. Rudd recalls that Lees, mid-sentence, stopped in class one day and asked, "What are we doing at university?" Having heard the utilitarian responses of his students, Leys said simply, "We are doing only two things, learning to think and then thinking." May the combination of religio, mores and cultura sustain you all here at Scranton during the forthcoming Quinn era. And may this campus be a privileged place where religion and human rights walk hand in hand for the well-being of persons and societies here, far away down under, and all places in between. Father Kevin Quinn, I invite you to take on your mantle of university presidency, recalling the words of your beloved late president at Santa Clara, Paul Locatelli. We must challenge the illusion of privilege and isolated individualism. We must bind ourselves emotionally and functionally to others and to the earth. Let this be a campus where religion and human rights have nothing to fear from each other, each being indispensable to truth and the dignity of all. Thank you.
Allow me to conclude the evening with just a couple thank yous. Let me begin, if I may, by thanking the co-chairs of the Inauguration Committee that created the environment at which Father Brennan could speak, Dean Deb Pellegrino and Bobby Davis. Thank you, Deb and Bobby. Let me thank Father Quinn for bringing Father Brennan to the University of Scranton. Thank you, Father. Thank you, Judge Gibbons, for your introduction of your long-lost cousin. Thank you, Jim. And most importantly, I would ask that you join me in thanking Father Brennan for those thought-provoking remarks. Thank you, Father Brennan. Thank you all for being here. What a great turnout. What a great way to continue the celebration of the inauguration of our next president. Let me invite all of you, each and every one of you, to join us at the next event, which will be held Thursday at 4 o'clock when we gather as a community to celebrate the Holy Eucharist together in celebration of this inauguration. 4 o'clock Thursday in the Byron Athletic Complex. Everyone is welcome. Thank you again for being here tonight, and thank you, Father Brennan.